So welcome to the American College Alumni Association webinar, Jean Jadot, Paul's Man in Washington, presented by John Alonzo Dick. My name is Mark Matoza, and I assist with the website for the American College Alumni Association, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you, those who are able to watch live and those who will be able to watch the recording. John A. Dick, known as Jack, is a US American born and raised in Michigan who has lived in Belgium for 30 years. He holds licentiates in historical theology from the University of Nijmegen and the Catholic University of Leuven, and doctorates in religious studies, PhD, and historical theology, STD, from KU Leuven. He was also a student at the American College from 1965 to 1968. Among books that Jack has written are The Moline Conversation Revisited, 1989, From Moline to ARCIC in 1997, with A. Deneau, Aggiornamento, Catholicism from Gregory XVI to Benedict XVI, and in 2013 with J. Metapenigan and K. Schlenkens. And his most recent book published this year is Jean Jadot, Paul's Man in Washington, which today's webinar is all about. For 13 years, he was the Director of Continuing Education and Director of American Formation at the American College in Leuven. He was the third person to hold the chair for the study of religion and values in American society at the KU Leuven. For 30 years, he has taught courses about religion and values in American society at the KU Leuven and the University of Ghent. For several years, he was a staff member at the KU Leuven European Center for Ethics. He is currently retired, but teaches 2 classes a week about trends in US society at Seniorama in Leuven, and he regularly writes and speaks in Europe and the USA about Christianity, fundamentalism, and religious trends in the United States. I have known Jack since 1990 and have had the occasion to hear him speak in Belgium, in Germany to priests in the US military, and to alumni in the United States as well. Jack's historical perspective always provides nuanced insights that are worthy of further reflection so that the gospel may be shared with joy. Now, alumni and friends, it is my pleasure to welcome Jack Dick to share insights from his newest book that have formed and continue to form the church. Jack, I turn it over to you.
Okay. Many thanks, Mark. I'm very happy to be with all of you. I want to thank Tuck Grinnell for the invitation to do this, and especially, of course, Mark for all his help in making it possible. Okay. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I will give some commentary as I go through it, and then
Jack, you're frozen.
For some reason, yes, I don't know why.
No, you're back now. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So it says my internet connection is unstable. I don't know why that is, but well, we'll continue here. So major life events. I'm just not going to read it all to you, but you can read that yourself. But he comes from he was born in Brussels, comes from a family of engineers, bankers. I would also have to say that the Jadot family is probably one of the most sophisticated families in Belgium and Belgian history, going way back to the days of the Congo. During the First World War, his father took the family to London for safety. So as you can see, they were there throughout the duration of World War I. Jadot was, from the time he was a little boy, his family called him Mr. Why. That's because young Jean would continually go around and say, pourquoi, pourquoi? And his grandmother said with a little bit of annoyance, Monsieur Pourquoi? But I've often thought about this Mr. Why, because I think it really goes to the heart of Jadot's ministry. Why? Why do we do what we do? Yeah. Later on, of course, he became very closely associated with Cardin, Joseph Cardin, who of course made very popular the expression see, observe, and act. And I think those two things, the Mr. Why, the see, observe, and act, really help explain Jadot. He studied philosophy in Leuven, also in Paris. In 1930, when he was 21 years old, he completed a doctorate here in Leuven at the Institute of Philosophy, magna cum laude. The doctorate was about the British philosopher, Taylor. I asked Jadot, well, can I read a copy of your dissertation? He said, no. He said it was never published and it never should be. Then he started laughing and he said, you know, I was only 21 years old. I think they just gave me the doctorate as a gift. His father had hoped that Jadot would become, a professor someday, happily married with a family, etc. Jadot kept saying he wanted to become a priest. In 1927, his father sent him to the United States to visit various business people. And later on, Jadot's father told him, I hope that when you went to the United States, you would fall in love with big business. And he said, I really hoped you would fall in love with a nice young American girl and end up marrying her. Well, it didn't happen. The following year, his father sent him to Africa for the same reasons. I don't know if he wanted him to marry an African, but he certainly wanted him to get into what we would call today multinational business. He entered the seminary here in Mechelen in 1930 and was ordained in 1934. Then, yes, he had various chaplaincies with young people, working with Joseph Cardin and the Cardin communities, young Christian workers, young Christian students, also a military chaplain for the Belgian military. And then in 1968, he was ordained a bishop by Cardinal Soenens. Very early in Jadot's life, Soenens became very much aware of him and took a great interest in him. In fact, later on, Jadot's close relationship with Pope Paul really, you can say, was due to the influence of Soenens, who kept telling Pope Paul, pay attention to this young Belgian bishop. Then his diplomatic career began already in '68. You can see here Thailand, Laos, Malaysia, etc. Then Cameroon, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea. Then, of course, the United States, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes, 1973 to 1980. 1980, his resignation from being apostolic delegate to the United States was happily accepted by John Paul II, and Jadot went to Rome for 4 years. I've often asked Jadot what it was like working in Rome, and he said the best summary is For 4 years, I was given every courtesy, but never any friendship. On occasion, he had a rather, shall I say, stormy relationship with John Paul II. He came back to Brussels, 84, and retired, of course, as a retiree. And then he passed away in Brussels in 2009. In his, yes, actually close to 100 years old. He was born, remember, in 2009. He was very close to the American College, as many of you know. Here's one of my favorite Jadot photos of him at a liturgy at the college in 1990. I first met him in 1986. And it was really in that first meeting at the American College. We took a walk in the backyard, and he said, "You're a young historian." Well, I said, "Yeah, young is probably a compliment," but he said, "I would like you to do my biography." But he said, "You have to promise me it will not be published until after my death." And then he started laughing. And after the death of a certain number of cardinals, whose names I will give you later. Okay. How would you characterize the Jadot bishops? Well, they were not big business type managers, much more pastorally oriented. And Jadot was responsible for 113 new bishops and 15 archbishops. Ironically, his first bishop was Bernard Law, but then Jadot reminded me that the appointment of Law was already in process when he became apostolic delegate. Jadot had a bit of apprehension about people saying that Law was handpicked by him. He really wasn't. He was picked by Jadot's predecessor, but then Jadot had to follow through on it. One of my favorite Jadot Bernard Law recollections is if you go back to 2001, when the Boston Globe came out with a big story about sexual abuse in the Archdiocese of Boston, and Bernard Law turning a blind eye to it. It was sometime shortly after that, I was visiting Jadot, and he said, this would be early in 2001 after the Boston Globe expose. And Law said, I have to tell you that Law had hardly ever contacted Jadot. And this was really the first time since 1973, we're now in 2001. This was the first time that Law contacted Jadot. He called him and he said, hello, Archbishop, this is Bernard Law. And Jadot said, well, yes, hello. Why are you calling? And Law said, well, I'm in a lot of trouble. And Jadot said, yes, I think you are. And Law said, I'm calling you to see if you can get me out of trouble. And Jadot said, Bernard, you created that mess. You put yourself into all these problems, and only Bernard can get himself out of them. There's really nothing I can do for you. So I think it's best if we just stop the conversation right now and he hung up. Well, I was in Jadot's apartment the day after that happened, and I said, so, yeah, what do you think about all this sexual abuse stuff? And he said, well, yeah, it's terrible, of course, but, he said, in my experience in Rome, I have to tell you, I saw every conceivable kind of sexual deviancy behind the Vatican walls. But he said, we won't talk about that. I said, no, let's not. Okay, so the first bishop was Bernard Law. The last one was my friend from Michigan, Kenneth Untner, who was a very, very fine man. So my collaboration with Jadot, yes, over a period of several years, with notebook and tape recorder in hand, I asked Archbishop Jadot questions. Sometimes I prepared them ahead of time and sent them to him. And of course, we had very candid observations. When it began in '86, I really didn't know Jadot very well, and I was a rather hesitant fellow. And I think it must have been our second meeting. It was in his apartment, and I said, well, I would like to start talking about various bishops. Jadot said, fine. And I presented a list of bishops. I said, let's begin with Cardinal Cody. Jadot said, fine. I said, well, Archbishop, people have some questions about Cody. He said, questions? I said, yes. So what do you mean questions? I said, well, I think people question his honesty. So looked at me, leaned closer to me, and he said, there's no question. Jadot was a crook. And well, I started chuckling, and then he started chuckling, but then very seriously, he said, yes, he was a crook. And then he looked at me and he said, John, he called me John in those early days. John, we are going to have a lot of things we have to discuss. So in the course of a long friendship that lasted close to 30 years, the Archbishop gave me access to documentation, his correspondence, especially hundreds of pages of correspondence with his family, his diaries, which I found very touching, going through his diaries each year to see not only what he was doing, but what his candid observations were about some of the people whom he met. And of course, photos, etc. I became his archivist. And for a while, all of his archives were held at the American College. And then shortly before the college closed, when I was becoming a bit concerned about, actually I was becoming concerned about what was going to happen to the archives, whether the college closed or not, I made contact with Jadot's nephew, Louis de Stryker, and we made arrangements with the French University of Louvain-la-Neuve, to move the Jadot archives to Louvain-la-Neuve. Jadot, I would say, was a wonderfully wise, warm, and supportive friend. I remember one time when I was sitting down with him, I said, we really are going through a very difficult time in the church. He said, yes, it's winter now, but spring will return. And I've often thought about that. I think we've gone through many winters. We might be going through one right now, but spring will return. The man had a wonderful optimism. Yes, a great realist, but a wonderful optimism. Yes, as I said, Pope Paul VI held Jadot in very high regard. In fact, there were about 3 main times while he was apostolic delegate to the United States that Jadot, because of his own health problems, but more particularly because of problems with some American bishops like Carberry and Crowell and Cody. About 3 times he offered his resignation to Paul VI. And Paul VI said, no, I refuse to accept your resignation. You are the man I want to have there because you are the kind of representative we need. In 1980, of course, he was very worn out. He offered his resignation to Pope Paul VI, and it was happily accepted. And then he really worked, I have to say, pretty much in papal disfavor for 4 years as president of the Secretariat for Non-Christians. I'm not trying to badmouth Pope John Paul. All I'm saying is that the rapport between John Paul II and Jadot was very problematic. At staff meetings or committee meetings, the language that was used for committee meetings at the Pope's request was Italian. And he knew that Jadot's Italian was not that perfect. Jadot knew that John Paul's French was extremely good, and he had questioned all the members of his committee about their French, and they all said, why, of course, there's no problem. Let's have our meetings in French. So they presented it to John Paul, and he started laughing, and he said, no, 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 we are in Rome. The language of Rome is Italian. It may not be the language of our Belgian friend, but that's his problem. So here we are, the good friends, Jadot and John Paul. Yes, you could really say they were extremely good friends, and very, Pope Paul, of course, was extremely supportive of Jadot. Well, the 2 perspectives. What Paul VI appreciated was that Jadot selected pastoral men for bishops. Bishops who would listen to and respond to the signs of the times. John Paul II wanted more institutional men who listened and were obedient to Rome. Jadot told me in one of his key exchanges with Pope John Paul, Jadot said, I have recommended men for bishop who will listen to the people. And John Paul started laughing, and then he said, but I don't want bishops who listen to the people. I want bishops who listen to Rome. Okay. Yes, I remember being with Archbishop Jadot the day the announcement came out that his successor, Pio Laghi, was being named a cardinal. Jadot had called me that morning and asked if he could come over and have lunch with his friends at the American College. I said, yes, of course. We met and had a delightful lunch. No one said anything about Lagi's becoming a cardinal, although we had all heard the news by that time. After lunch, Jadot and I walked back to his car, which was parked in the parking lot across from Heilig Heart Hospital. Just before he opened the door, he turned to me and he said, "Did you hear the news today?" I said, "Yes, just after your phone call this morning." "Well," Jadot said, "I had to be with my US friends today. It is not important to be a cardinal. What bothers me is that I know this is not about being a cardinal. It's a papal slap in my face." Well, my book about Jadot. Although I have to confess I had great affection and personal regard for Archbishop Jadot, I hope readers will find that my book is well documented and gives an objective look at a man who had a major impact, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, on the Catholic Church in the United States. The focus is very much on the man, Jean Jadot, his character, his vision, and his pastoral ministry. The book is not hagiography, but history. I would like to focus on some key moments and what I would call the big turning point for Jadot as apostolic delegate in the United States. That key moment was his November 1976 bicentennial address to the US bishops, titled "A Watchman for the House of Israel." Jadot considered the US bishops as watchmen for US Catholics. And he told them, "My brother bishops, I would like to share with you this morning some of the signs that I read in our times and that we see from afar, and be prepared for what is coming." Here's one of my favorite Jadot photos. It's a picture of Jadot just before giving his bicentennial address. I've often discussed this photo with the Archbishop, and I said, "You look very pensive." And he said, "I was scared to death." He said, "I knew that my remarks would probably be received by most bishops in a not so happy way." So anyway, Jadot, just before they called him to the podium to give his address. Jadot had four main concerns. One problem, he said, that we will have to face very soon, and at most within 10 years, is a shortage of priests. I want to be very frank and candid with you. He said, "I'm worried that so many of us, laity, clergy, bishops, do not seem to be concerned that if not today, then in about 5 years, we will not be able to staff our parishes and institutions with priests as we did in the past." Another problem, he said, which will grow in the coming years, is the size of our Christian communities. Jadot, remember, traveled all across the country many times, and what struck him was some of the very large parishes with large gatherings for liturgies. And he often told me, he said, we need to really have smaller communities where people know each other and can be supportive of one another. Getting back to his address here before the bishops. People today, he said, especially young people, are searching for a group in which they can find a true communion for worship, for commitment. Many are suffering, he said, from a certain feeling of loneliness. The third problem, he said, a problem that is with us today and will undoubtedly increase in time is the problem of minorities. He says, I refer to pastoral care for ethnic and racial minorities, whether Catholic or non-Catholic. At times, Jadot said, I wonder if the majority of our priests and people realize our shortcomings in these areas, and even our arrogance towards our brothers and sisters of the faith who are in some ways different from ourselves. And then the fourth set of remarks is that there are other problems near or far on the horizon. I can mention the question of the role of women in society and in the church, the problems that will come from the rejection of traditional standards of morality in social, political, and business life. Well, when Jadot concluded his address, some bishops applauded enthusiastically, but just a few actually. Many others sat there silent and dumbfounded. Others sat staring at him, staring angrily at him. And this autumn 76 meeting with the US bishops was clearly the big moment of transition for Archbishop Jadot in the United States. I would say after this 76th lecture, the pro and anti-Jadot polarization became very strong. Cardinal Carberry from St. Louis was a very strong Jadot critic. Carberry was furious. John Kroll, also furious, and sent negative reports to his friends back at the Vatican. And then later on, of course, Kroll would become very close to his friend John Paul II and work very hard to undermine Jadot. Kroll, of course, was one of John Paul's closest advisors. Yeah, two Polish gentlemen supporting each other. Contrary to what I sometimes hear and sometimes read, Jadot was not a wild liberal. He was not a far-out liberal theologian. I would say he was open-minded and very pastorally oriented. He was indeed very keenly aware that a changing world needed creative church leaders alert to the signs of the times. Although he had no particular assigned ministries during his retirement, Jadot became a frequent visitor of elderly priests. Once a month, he met for lunch and discussions with a group of retired diplomats and business people. He became a regular Eucharistic presider for the sisters in Berlaymont in Waterloo. And of course, he presided at liturgies and was a frequent guest speaker at the American College in Leuven. and where we also met periodically, as some of you know very well, for lunch with the college faculty. On January 21st, 2009, Archbishop Jadot died peacefully in his residence in Brussels. At that time, he was in an assisted care residence in Brussels. His family and many friends were near him. Archbishop Robert, the Apostolic Nuncio to Belgium, had come just the day before he died with a special papal blessing. Joska and I joined the small group of family and friends at the Archbishop's bedside the day after his death. Archbishop Jadot was laid out in a white alb on his bed in his bedroom. In keeping with his wishes, his body was given to the Université Catholique de Louvain for medical research. I found that amazing. And when I think back about his funeral, Jadot had said many times that when it came time for his funeral, he did not want to have the traditional funeral for a bishop. He said, I've gone to too many of these and I really don't like them. I said, well, yeah, I don't think you can avoid that. And he started laughing and he said, well, I'm thinking about what I might do. Anyway, so his funeral was actually a wonderful service. And the only thing you saw was a large portrait of him before the altar. Okay. So, yeah, there's the book. Paul's Man in Washington, yes, it's available from Amazon. Other sellers are supposed to be coming out with it, but I think the best way to get it is either as an ebook for $6.96 at Amazon or a paperback for $15. People who want more information can contact me at my University of Leuven address, jackpointdick@kuleuven.be. Yes, so that's basically it. Thank you for your attention to this little overview about the man and the book. And I think we have a few minutes. If you do have some questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. I'll just get back here to another picture of Jadot. Yeah, well, here. We'll get back to that one. Okay.
Thank you, Jack, so much for that presentation and great overview of your book. I had the chance to read it, and working in Washington, I was happy to see some of the references of his experiences here in the 70s, and then be able to understand a little bit deeper about the history of the Catholic Church here in the United States. So I will go ahead and turn the recording off now, and then we'll have the chance to have some questions.
Okay, great.